Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze, this week in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
In the main part of the show this week, we're going to talk about Venezuela and the possibility of a looming war with the United States, with the Trump administration threatening to expand its attacks on Venezuelan boats that are ongoing. So we're going to sort of unpack all the economics related to that possible war. But first, we wanted to talk about a few things in the news in the United States. There has been a fair amount of news this week that we would be remiss not to discuss. The first thing, Adam, is as I mentioned, you are in New York. New York was very much at the center of political developments this week with the election of a new mayor. New York's Mayor Mamdani will be taking office. We discussed Mamdani's campaign earlier this year when he won the Democratic primary. He is a democratic socialist, and we sort of tried to talk about some of the general issues. But now that he's won the election, I think it would be worth dipping back in. And what strikes me, at least, I wanted to ask you about is Mamdani's not the first leftist mayor in New York City. Obviously, he's getting a lot of headlines for the victory. But I sort of wanted to put it a bit in context. I mean, like even just a few years ago, New York had a leftist mayor, Bill de Blasio, who campaigned on a kind of similar themes in trying to improve the inequality in the city, promising to tax the rich, etc. So, what is the significance of Mamdani's victory in that context? I mean, in what ways is Mamdani different than the recent leftist victory of Bill de Blasio, say?
I think it's a generational shift apart from anything else. He's the first person of his age. I mean, he's in his 30s. I mean, he's very overt about his commitment to democratic socialism. That, I think, in and of itself is a kind of novelty. It's an effect of the radicalization of the mainstream almost of New York City politics, or at least a substantial minority. He's the first Muslim. And he faced a barrage of attacks, which I think in its intensity is quite unprecedented, certainly in recent times, right? He made very little effort to compromise with the mainstream assumptions over critical issues to local political culture, notably Israel during the horrific Israeli punishment campaign in Gaza. And I think that's really what marks this as a new phase. I mean, the way it's being presented, I have colleagues, Lena Khan, who I actually did a panel with, former FTC chair under the Biden administration. I mean, they're treating it like a presidential transition. They have a transition team. They're celebrating that. I mean, it's clearly being seen as a embryo of a revived and powerful left politics in the US. And I think because of the broader national context, de Blasio was mayor during the Obama administration. This is a more kind of asterisks and obelisks, kind of the last village defending a decent vision of American progressivism against Trump in the absence of any serious leadership from the Democratic Party in Congress. You could say from a centrist position that it's the East Coast answer to Newsom. It's also, of course, true that Michelle Wu in Boston was elected. I don't think she was even opposed. So there is an emerging coalition of vocal, prominent Democratic folks that are really wanting to kick against mainstream assumptions. It'll be interesting to see whether there's any diplomacy, you might say, between the New York administration and Newsom in California, though, of course, they're operating at radically different levels. Like, this is a city, it's subject to Hochul, but nevertheless, it has that kind of spirit. We will see. We discussed in the episode on this how much wiggle room, how much scope for action he will actually have as mayor. But the mood was certainly one of almost like a presidential election victory.
Yeah, it does. It strikes me as correct that this generational shift is part of the significance, and then more specifically, the relationship to Israel in the campaign was significant in the New York context, and those two issues are themselves related. If you look at polls, and
Yeah.
younger generations'
Yeah.
relationship to Israel is itself markedly different in the United States generally.
Yeah.
And growing up near New York, I remember David Dinkins' campaign was also a sort of avowed leftist, a sort of a black mayor, New York's first black mayor who was ran for office on a leftist campaign. But I think he visited Israel during the campaign. He was sort of obliged to show uh, uh, um, uh, that connection in a way that clearly Zohran Mamdani hasn't felt it necessary. So
Yeah, Mamdani. I mean, Mamdani's line, and it's a very important one, is that his concern as a New York politician and as a New York mayor committed to anti-racism and making this a decent city is with anti-Semitism against Jewish citizens of the city of New York, and with that constituency he stands foursquare against any manifestation of racism against them, but that he has no brief to support Israel. It's not, and so that connection driving a wedge into that assumed affiliation is a key political move. I was chairing a discussion of Mark Mazower's recently launched book on the history of anti-Semitism, the word, which is a brilliant reconstruction of the way in which that link, which you described, was actually forged, because it was anything other than obvious from either side, either from the point of view of the first generation of Israeli founders who couldn't really understand how you could claim to be a Zionist and live in New York. If you're serious about your Zionism, get to Israel. And conversely, from the point of view of many Jews in New York, it wasn't obvious that Israel had any really exorbitant and necessary claim on their identity or their loyalty. And that connection was forged over time. And I think one of Mamdani's strategies is to try and break that. And he knows that there is a substantial constituency of progressive, especially younger Jews in New York, who welcome that, embrace that absolutely as essential to thinking through their situation. But it really is interesting if you contrast Cuomo, who after all represents one of the great classic ethnic cultural constituencies that made New York, the Italian-American connection, and on the other hand, Mamdani standing for this very much more reconfigured kind of vision of New York. And then you look at the electoral pattern. There was this great thing going around on Twitter about 80% of people who are New Yorkers and entitled to vote here but have only been here for 5 years voted for Mamdani. And I think when we get to those who were born in New York, it's 50% Cuomo, 30% Mamdani. That kind of pivot. So it's really it's a kind of new vision of the globality of New York from its kind of classic 20th century identity as also already then, of course, a world city, but a world city of a different kind of world than the 2020s New York.
Yeah, and I suppose by the same token, it's worth remembering that there were other elections in the U.S. This week as well, and the Democrats were victorious in the state of New Jersey, the state of Virginia, even in some state elections in Georgia, and it was not Democratic socialists running for office for the governorships of those states, and yeah, those are perhaps more slow-moving political cultures, maybe not as globalized, as New York City is, and all of which is to say, we'll see how the Democratic Party evolves in the years ahead. But Donald Trump was in the news this week in the United States, aside from his relationship to these state elections happening. Namely, there was a very important economic case before the Supreme Court, namely about the constitutionality of the tariffs that Trump has been imposing under a law which Trump claims allows him to impose these tariffs in conditions of an emergency. The Supreme Court has been considering whether that in fact holds true. It seems like even the conservative judges on the Supreme Court doubt or potentially doubt the constitutionality of these tariffs. So that raises the question of what happens if they are overturned. And I was wondering, Adam, I mean, if the money needs to be uh, returned to the to the people who've been paying it, how does that work in practice? Could that actually be a benefit to all of the businesses who have been paying tariffs and raising prices perhaps already in response? I mean, it won't be the consumers who will be getting money back, but the businesses, I guess, who have been paying the tariffs, and I guess sort of now may get money on both ends. If they get the money back from the government and have already been charging consumers more, it seems like it may actually work to their benefit. Is that one way of thinking about this?
I mean, I think it's very complicated. I mean, just to outline the drama of the case, the hearings began on Wednesday. I was at a dinner at the Council of Foreign Relations on Tuesday night, and there were literally trade experts getting the last flight out of New York to arrive, around midnight, early in the morning on Wednesday, and queue up from 3 a.m. outside the Supreme Court to get their seats in the hearing. We're recording on Thursday morning. I don't believe the court is in session yet, but the reports from the end of the first day of proceedings on Wednesday suggested that the court was not looking convinced by the defense being offered by the administration. The case is really about the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act passed by Congress to issue essentially a complete redrafting of American trade policy. And the contention of the plaintiffs, which is a group of businesses whose business has been severely affected, is that this is an absolutely illegitimate extension of presidential power, which was granted for one-off measures to meet concrete and specific emergencies. And instead, the Trump administration is saying we need a change of policy direction. They don't think they'd get the congressional majorities, so they're just doing it by way of these powers. It seems easy to see how the court, maintaining its conservative face, could nevertheless rule. Then there would indeed be a huge issue, because I think it's over 110 billion, something like this, in tariffs. And some of those tariffs have very much been paid directly by consumers. I will stick my hand up. I have a rather bad habit of buying exotic scarves on eBay, and those come from all over the world. And once upon a time, they were exempted under the de minimis exception. So, if you had only a small catchage, you didn't pay, but they removed that. And so all of a sudden, they, a not exorbitantly expensive garment from Japan, I think it came from Tokyo, had a $35 tax on it, which was collected by DHL, who were the people that were delivering it. And I couldn't take delivery, and they were going to send it back to Japan until I roused myself to pay this by credit card. I would expect to get that back. I mean, it didn't go to DHL. It didn't go to the merchant in Tokyo. I paid it, and I paid the US government, as far as I understand. Like, I want my $35 back. The real issue, of course, is that I know people who've turned away from business. Like, was talking with a fashionable friend who has a much more expensive clothes habit than me, and she was saying that she had similarly found some beautiful item that she was lusting after, and then had discovered that when she pressed the button to buy it, it was crazy. It was like, it was originally $250 for a vintage garment, so God knows what it cost original. And then all of a sudden, when she clicked the button, it was $390. And I think she decided not to make the purchase. So that harm, of course, can't easily be undone. My facetious idea was that we should create a fighting fund and donate all of our already paid taxes to the legal bills of those in contention with the Trump administration, and an electoral fund to ensure that Trump or the GOP are defeated at the next possible occasion. Because $100 billion would go quite a long way in the American political system if only 10% of us decided that we would rather put our money towards ending the actual threat of tariffs, we would have a very substantial political organization. This is all pie in the sky. We'll see how the court
But just
rules.
Mechanically, I mean, the government would be able to reverse these charges, essentially. Like, it has a record of where the money's been coming from. I mean, like, I just wonder,
an electronic record. I mean, they'd have to create a website where you could demonstrate. And I mean, at the one level, international trade is like hopelessly ramified, and at another level, in the end, for that kind of shipment, it all goes by way of FedEx, UPS,
Mm.
DHL, like the number of carriers is actually quite finite. And they all had to create websites to make these charges. So I paid a DHL website.
But
And that charge presumably then went up to the US government. So presumably there's a way of reversing that. But
and are there, I mean, any other
you were so into
implications?
this.
I know. I'm just curious if there are like just the swings of on the U.S. balance sheet. If all of a sudden it needs to return all this money, is that itself a problem? Potential
Yeah, it'd be a
problem? Like,
dent. Yeah, it would
yeah.
certainly create a cash flow issue.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, you should. Sounds like you should
I'm looking forward to my.
keep that receipt and send it to Scott Bessent at some
Yeah.
point soon, and maybe you can get those $35 back. But as I said at the top, we did want to talk about Venezuela and get into get a bit into the weeds there about what's going on. And so, as usual, I'd like to start with the data point, and the data point there is 1 million, as in 1 million barrels of oil, which is the number of barrels of oil that Venezuela is currently producing approximately per day. That is a fraction of its peak production. In the early 2000s, Venezuela used to pump around 3 million barrels per day. And that drop is the result of a bunch of factors, including, a lack of maintenance, insufficient capital in Venezuela, but also its relationship to the U.S., namely U.S. sanctions that have been placed on the country in recent years, and now the growing threat of outright war and regime change that Trump and his administration seem to be contemplating. That's already expressed itself in the form of attacks on Venezuelan boats that the United States claims have been carrying drugs, and we'll see whether this expands into a broader war. But yeah, to unpack about the general economics of this U.S. Venezuelan relationship right now, I wanted to start off by asking about Venezuela's oil economy generally. I mean, has Venezuela essentially for its entire history been a petro state? I mean, from what I can tell, it has the largest oil reserves in the world, and so has that always been something that's defined the state and I guess maybe defined its pathologies as well?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, a kind of reality check because US conversations about Latin America often take this sort of generic, imprecise kind of quality, which is an expression of the extraordinary hierarchy and power difference in the relationships. I mean, Venezuela, to make sure we have it on our map, is a country of 35 million people, so it's about the size of California, of which, as a result of the ongoing crisis, about 7 million have left. It's one of the largest refugee crises in the world, and it's on America's quote unquote doorstep. It's a really disastrous situation, and the fact that American policy has been as lackadaisical as it has, as punitive and unconstructive, and now tending towards literally threats of war in a like totally casual way. Like New York Times has got like little discussions about how America might do it. Will it strike? Will it just send hit teams? With all of which is illegal essentially, right? There's no UN mandate. There's no basis for a declaration of war other than the Americans say so, and them declaring the Venezuelan regime to be, a drug regime. Or, I mean, it's extraordinary. This isn't to say that Maduro's regime is not oppressive, or that one wouldn't in some ways desire regime change. For heaven's sake, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the Peace Prize to a Venezuelan activist demanding that. But the casualness with which this is discussed is just worth highlighting and underlining because it's pretty surreal at times. This is, we should say, in the context of a crazy Trump episode, the same phase in which America appears to be openly discussing the possibility of intervening in Nigeria. So, things are becoming somewhat deranged, and the derangement is on the side of the US as much as anywhere else. But yes, the Venezuelan economy is heavily dependent on oil now, but no, it has not always been that way. So throughout the 19th century, you would have described Venezuela, broadly speaking, as a probably coffee-dependent economy more than anything else, right? It was and cacao. But it was above all the weak, war-scarred state. The history of Venezuela's emergence as an independent state is the stuff, after all, of Bolivarian legend. And it's really from 1914 onwards, with the first big oil discoveries, that Venezuela has emerged as a powerhouse. And it's with the nationalization of the oil assets, 50-50 profit sharing regime in the 40s and 50s, and then full nationalization in the framework of the PDVSA, that, a true oil-centered regime emerged. This is in the context of OPEC politics, the 73 oil crisis, the sudden boom in oil prices that made Venezuela, gave it, the promise of huge riches. Because having oil in the early 20th century, when oil prices were really bargain basement, was one thing. Having oil from the 70s onwards was quite another. But then that also exposed Venezuela in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s to repeated shocks to its economy following the oil price. So as as oil becomes this global asset with an entirely different price level from the 1970s onwards, and as in Venezuela, oil is concentrated in the PDVSA as a kind of anchoring state capitalist vehicle, you are exposed in the 1980s to the downward shocks in oil prices, which produce huge tremors in Venezuelan society, and then driving and underpinning the Chavez and Maduro regimes from the early 2000s and into the 2010s was a huge surge in oil prices up to the structural break in 2014, which hurled the Venezuelan society and the post-Chavez regime into deep crisis. So Venezuela has become more and more dependent on oil, and with that also strapped to this really vicious whiplash logic of global oil prices.
Yeah, I'm also curious about the ways that the oil sector in Venezuela entangles Venezuela with the U.S. economy and the U.S. oil economy. I mean, there are a couple of U.S. oil companies that play a big role in Venezuela, or have played a big role. Chevron is one, Citgo is another. So yeah, what is the nature of these entanglements, and is it possible to disentangle the two?
Yeah, both on the supply and the demand side. So Chevron is responsible, as you say, for about 25% of Venezuelan production, insofar as we can call a normal year in Venezuela, insofar as that exists. And the biggest market for the Venezuelan crude has always been the US. And that has conditioned a desperate search on the Venezuelan part for alternative markets. And from the early 2000s onwards, that then became the basis for a deep entanglement, very one-sided, but nevertheless real entanglement between the Chavez government and China, because China was emerging as a key oil buyer, the biggest global source of demand growth. And Chavez looked for Chinese support and received it in various forms. So as part of China's outward movement of investment and technology, it built a relationship with Venezuela and has had a really hard time, earning any return on that investment. It has not proved, I think, a very successful Chinese engagement. But that was driven very much by the realization, as you say, on the Venezuelan part, that, like it or not, they are caught within the sphere of American power.
You've been referring in this discussion a bit to the Chavez Maduro regime, or suggesting that there's some kind of break there that groups those two Venezuelan leaders together, and yet at the same time, the United States, in referencing Maduro specifically, is suggested that he himself marks a break in Venezuela's political history, suggesting that Maduro is a kind of outright dictator, that took office in recent years after Chavez's death. So, should we be thinking of Maduro as a kind of break in Venezuelan history, as a first outright dictator, or is it, more plausible to think of Maduro and Chavez grouped together?
Well, I mean, Venezuela has had periods of military dictatorship in the more distant past. Chavez's regime, I think, is fair to say, yes, was distinctively different from Maduro. Now, you're involved in like hypotheticals, arguing, what a Chavez regime would have looked like under the impact of the oil crash in 2014. Would Trump administration, the first Trump administration, under the influence particularly of powerful Latin American anti-communist interests. This is a big Miami preoccupation, right? And we know the influence of right-wing Latino politicians and thinkers in the Trump circle. And what would a Chavez regime have looked like under those kind of? It's hard to tell. I don't want to personalize it at that level, but it's certainly true that yes, there is an escalation. So Chavez is hybrid. I mean, the political science tends to call it something more like a hybrid regime. That's between 1999 and 2013. I mean, it's based on an electoral success. It then faced a failed coup attempt in 2002, and then a highly political strike by the oppositional staff members of the PDVSA, the Central Oil Company, which both sides treated as a political struggle for the future of Venezuela. From that moment onwards, Chavez began progressively to build parallel institutions, the communal councils, the Bolivarian missions, began to deliberately try and transform the deep politics of Venezuelan society and the Venezuelan state. But it's really after his death and the installation of Maduro from 2014 onwards, when he faced violent street protests, he responded with massive force, jailed opposition leaders, engaged in more and more overt electoral manipulation, packed the Supreme Court so as to ensure favorable judgments, set up an unelected constituent assembly to redraft the constitution. I mean, this at this point really is clearly an authoritarian regime in every sense. And so, yes, there is an escalation intensity, a break with the transition from Chavez to Maduro, but it's also one that is driven by both internal forces, resistance within Venezuela, and external pressures. And both of those might very well have occurred under Chavez as well in a different scenario.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this past decade has been momentous for Venezuelans economically. Living standards in Venezuela have fallen by 74% by some measures between 2013 and 2023, and I read that would mark the fifth largest fall in living standards in any state in modern economic history. So, if we were to look at that experience, that fall off, to what extent is that the product of macroeconomic mismanagement by the Venezuelan government in that time, or to what extent is that the result of sanctions that the United States has been placing on the Maduro regime increasingly over time? What exactly is the cause of that?
I mean, the easiest way to break that down is chronologically, and I think you could argue that between 2000 through 2016, we have a progressive deterioration of the Venezuelan situation driven by internal struggles around the PDVSA. The oil company never really recovers from the politicized strike of 2002 to 2003. There's chronic underinvestment. There is an increasing reliance on external sources of funding like China to maintain investment. Then there's the oil price shock of 2014 to 2016, which combines with the fall in production from the increasingly ailing PDVSA to massively compress export revenues. The regime from 2003 onwards imposes foreign exchange controls, which lead to an overvaluation of the currency, which lead to a series of distortions within the domestic economy. There is credit financing, increasingly inflationary pressure within Venezuela. All of this proceeds, which is profoundly damaging and drives millions of Venezuelans into seeking a refuge outside Venezuela. This is a migrant flow that above all spills into Colombia. Colombia and Venezuela are, historically very closely tied together, have separated over the course of the 19th century, but are very close, both geographically and culturally. And so millions of Venezuelans essentially relocate to Colombia. And then with the first Trump administration, the sanctions arrive. So the 2017 financial sanctions, the oil sanctions in 2019, which aim at restricting exports, then a further tightening between 2020 and 2022, with some relief delivered as the pressure really becomes unbearable. And the Biden administration is trying to manage global energy markets in the context of the Ukraine war. But I think most analysts would see this as two distinct phases, with the original damage being done by largely domestic factors and the vagaries of the global oil market, and then the powerful impact of American sanctions from 2017 onwards.
Yeah, the Trump administration has clearly decided in the second iteration of its administration to target Venezuela, and seems to be aiming for a regime change there. That's been indicated by Trump's own comments about Maduro, in addition to the strikes that have already been ordered on Venezuelan boats. And the basis for that bid for regime change is that Venezuela poses a national security threat because it is allegedly a narco state. That is not a term with a kind of fixed meaning in American legal vocabulary, but it is a claim that Venezuela relies on the production of drugs and the export of drugs to the United States, that is some kind of essential part of its economy and a part of the state's economy. And I'm curious about, how we would evaluate that claim. I mean, what role are drugs and drug cartels playing in the overall political economy of Venezuela right now?
I mean, it's just the typical kind of sloppy. I mean, largely just it's made up in large part, right? So it is true that, say, 10, high side 15%. I've seen estimates as low as 8% of Colombian cocaine production is channeled, as you'd expect if you just look at the map. You can go across the border for Colombia and gain access to the Caribbean or the Atlantic coast of Venezuela, lightly policed zones of the Venezuelan territory. You can then there work with the Cartel de los Soles, which is, a kind of the nickname, the name for a group of essentially rather corrupt police and National Guard officials. The Soles refers to the suns that they wear on their epaulets. And you can thereby, account for plausibly, like I say, about 10% of the Colombian cocaine traffic. But there's no fentanyl, which is notionally at the center of this program. It's clearly not the most direct route. The vast majority of Colombian cocaine is smuggled more directly north, some by land, the majority by sea. And the argument that this is at the core of the Maduro regime, there's no doubt that in survival mode, certain elements of that regime are increasingly resorting both to drug smuggling and more or less informal gold mining from the very large gold deposits that are in Venezuela. Venezuela is thought to have, at current hugely inflated gold prices, $250 to $350 billion worth of gold, which could be excavated, and some official mining is going on, but an awful lot of unofficial mining is also going on. No doubt there are parts of the Venezuelan regime where this is happening, But the idea that this is the sort of central character of the Venezuelan regime, or defines why it's a key problem for the US, or from the American side, that this is the major source of America's drug problem, or even the trafficking problem. The drug problem, of course, resides in the US, but even the main avenue for trafficking is just disconnected from any real sense of reality. Venezuela just is a state which is in a sufficiently pariah status to enable the United States to deploy military force against it, at least hypothetically. And they've also been threatening Colombia, which has caused a large number of European governments to decide not to attend a joint European Latin American meeting in Colombia because they've designated and sanctioned Petro as a narco trafficante, and they've threatened military action against Colombia. So this really is an unhinged moment in American policymaking. And in the Venezuelan case, there is a kind of, there's a trail, right? There's a to call it a smoking gun kind of somewhat overstates it. Yes, there is reason to think that there is this kind of activity going on, but does it merit the deployment of this huge naval task force and the threats of military action, let alone like very open talk about mechanisms for regime change? Not by any reasonable standard, no.
And yet, nevertheless, that may in fact be the policy of the United States, which is why I do want to ask what the outcome of a potential regime change in Venezuela would be. And I suppose the question that came to mind is, to what extent is the current Venezuelan state, and aside from that, Venezuelan society, ideologically committed to Maduro or otherwise personally loyal to him? And I ask because, if there is a regime change, is it possible to think that the Venezuelan state could support a regime change for pragmatic reasons, just given the current, economic state of the country we've been discussing, and the possibility that it could improve under a new, ostensible regime? I mean, or on the other hand, is it plausible that the Chavez-Maduro state would mount or fight some sort of insurrection in the event of a regime change mounted by the United States?
I mean, it's difficult to even know where to start, but you're absolutely right. You just open the pages of a newspaper like the New York Times, and there America is calmly discussing the options ranging from F-35 strikes from Puerto Rico through to Navy SEAL operations to take out Maduro, through to that range of options that you're discussing, which is essentially like an Iraq 2003 option. I have to say, here we are. I mean, it drives me crazy, as you can tell. It's like, what are we doing? This is madness. I mean, it's a society of almost 30 million people in incredibly inhospitable terrain. Is that, do you really imagine that you can just go in there and flip a switch, or, take out one guy or his security detail and somehow bring about a change? It's extraordinary. At the very least, you're going to do is unleash most likely a quite violent civil war, massive civil disturbances within Venezuela. Again, this isn't to say that the Maduro regime is something that's easily to tolerate or easy to live with. It's just the irresponsibility of the conversation that is currently carried on in the US, and the options being discussed by the Trump administration suck one into a quasi-serious discussion of the options. The opinion polling seems to suggest that it's useful to distinguish three different things, right? One is there a kind of loyalty amongst large parts of Venezuelan society to the notion of Chavismo, like the project of a neo-Bolivarian left-wing Latin American politics anchored in Venezuela and its history? To which the answer would seem to be yes, there clearly is. And we might be talking about a substantial minority of people, 15 to 30%. And if there is anything calculated to strengthen that, it would be a blatant military intervention by the United States, and notably the Trump administration and its hawkish adherents, right? Compared to that, there is the question of how much specific loyalty to Maduro there is. And I think the answer to that is it's clearly much weaker. And then there would be the question of, okay, are the hard cores of resistance maybe around, for instance, the PSUV party machine, or key figures in the National Police or the National Guard, who, Iraq style, might initially retreat and then mount insurgency, or would simply want to fight this out from the very beginning? And those are the sorts of questions that would need to be seriously considered. I mean, no one in their right mind would engage in an open intervention and the assumption that you just hit this, the dominoes topple and the regime goes down, unless you had much better inside information than the US turned out to have, for instance, about Iraq in 2003, when basically it emerged that they'd willfully been allowed themselves to be led by the nose by highly unrepresentative Iraqi dissidents in exile. So this is a sort of level of knowledge on American national security policy in Latin America, which is not on my fingertips, and it's not my métier, but it is absolutely astonishing to see how casually this is being discussed, and it does seem to me just important to underline how extraordinary and it is that we're even talking in these terms.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think it's important to be discussing it in the background of these economic questions that we've been talking about, because I do think it's as if this regime change policy is premised on this idea. Well, the state has already been starved, the country's already been strangled economically. They could only want a change at this point, but of course things are not that simple. Which is not to say that, which is also not to say the United States won't
just try
anyway.
I mean, and crucially is like, is there any real? Is there would anyone reasonably believe that this is about Venezuela? Like, it's clearly not about Venezuela. It's about America's internal politics. It's about the desire of the Trump administration to be seen to be doing violent things. Like, it's literally about that. There was this extraordinary Lindsey Graham clip from this meeting between it's called like the GOP Friends of Israel, or GOP. And it's produced some amazing clips over the weekend. But Lindsey Graham literally says, in this kind of like barnstorming way, I'm feeling great about our country. I'm feeling great about our party. We're killing the right people. We are running out of bombs. We didn't even run out of bombs in World War II. I mean, this is a senior figure in the Republican Party. You can think what you like about Lindsey Graham. People make light of him, but he's a senior figure in the Republican Party, and there's no reason to think that the conversation or the seriousness of the conversation is any different in the inner circle around Trump.
Yeah, this is it's not an accident that there's talk of this revival of the Monroe Doctrine in this context, and the general history of imperialism, I suppose, makes it hard to separate the kind of economic questions from the political ones, from the military ones, and the kind of lust for violence in this way is sort of inseparable, I suppose. But we do not know what will happen, and we'll reserve the right to come back to talk about Venezuela if and when there is an explicit bid for regime change. But in the meantime, we will say goodbye for this week and be back as always 1 week from now.